Hello again. At least, I hope it's again, because you should definitely binge watch this entire debate right now. See the playlist in the pinned comment. Anyway, this is a debate between Cameron Bertuzzi and myself on whether horrendous suffering disproves God. Here I'll be offering my second rebuttal, so buckle up. Though it wasn't at all clear to me that Cameron's intention was to merely highlight the alleged boldness of logical problems of evil in his rebuttal, it seemed like more was going on than that. I'm happy to report an area of agreement. Logical problems of evil aren't dead. However, there still seems to be a disconnect between us as to whether they have a special burden of proof that other deductive arguments lack. They don't, which was part of Oppie's point in the quote that I shared earlier. My choice to defend a logical problem of evil in this debate isn't any bolder than someone like William Lane Craig presenting his standard deductive arguments for God, and to claim otherwise smacks of a double standard. Thankfully, we're actually in agreement about something else. 100% certainty is not a necessary condition to accept the premises and conclusion of Schellenberg's argument. This is important. One of my critiques of Cameron was that his opening statement set the bar for successful argument unreasonably high, as if I needed to convince the audience to form a firm conviction in each premise, rather than convince you that they're more plausible than not. I don't. In the midst of this discussion, some of you may be concerned that I'm trying to shift the burden of proof in an unfruitful way. But I think an illustration is in order. Consider debates surrounding whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. It's no doubt true that in such contexts, the Christian bears the primary burden of proof to convince the skeptic. However, it doesn't follow that skeptics bear absolutely no burden whatsoever. And frankly, I don't think most Christians would take people like me too seriously if we were to argue against their beliefs with the strategy Cameron is employing here. So the question remains, why take his approach seriously if you wouldn't in any other context? Regarding premise 1, if we're talking about a being that is construed as perfection and goodness personified, then that provides us with a strong reason to think that finite persons who ever more fully experience the reality of God realize their deepest good. This is not a mere assertion, but a consideration that counts in favor of the premise. The deepest good of finite persons will clearly be realized in relation to goodness personified in some capacity. And the phrase, ever more fully experience the reality of God, is meant to encompass those potential capacities. I've already shown that Schellenberg's phrasing here could absorb Cameron's proposed counterexamples offered in his opening statement, and I would argue any relevantly similar ones. So I don't really see any alternatives other than accepting the obvious truth of premise 1. If Cameron thinks my reasoning has gone wrong somewhere, then I challenge him to pinpoint exactly where. My defense of premise 2 was, and always has been, to point out that when we consider what kind of being God would be, we wouldn't expect him to need horrors to bring about our deepest good, of ever more fully experiencing the reality of God. This is what Schellenberg was gesturing towards in the quote that I shared in my opening statement as well. For clarity, I'm using the word need here in the following way. If premise 2 is false, God would need horrific suffering in the sense that it would be a necessary means to achieve his divine ends. In the immediate context, Schellenberg explains why this is highly implausible. Here we need to remember that growing relationship with God is short for something like an everlasting journey into the heart of God, in which ever fuller and richer experience and knowledge is obtained. How could one way of doing this be better than another? Given what God would have to show them, and here we can speak of an infinite good, that is, God is infinitely good, as well as of infinite richness, any number of finite persons could begin from the place determined by their makeup and move off in any direction, never exhausting the wonders of God, finding themselves stretched to the limits of their capacities for whole-making experience at every point along the way. This seems to just follow from what God is, an infinite and inexhaustible good, and from what such persons would be, finite and limited in all their capacities. Put another way, the extraordinary claim here isn't premise 2. It's the idea that an inexhaustibly good being could possibly be beholden in any way to a world where infants are, quote, tossed into the air and used as targets for machine guns. In a strange move, Cameron somehow interprets this appeal to God's infinite goodness, deepness, and richness as question-begging. First of all, we can also appeal to our limited capacities in contrast with God's splendor, as Schellenberg does here. Second, we're going to need more than mere accusations. Cameron needs to explain exactly how raising these considerations amounts to begging the question. Perhaps the Christian story can come to the rescue? Adding auxiliary hypotheses into theism to solve problems is fine. But in doing so, just notice that this, at least on the face of it, lowers its prior probability. More importantly though, my general defenses of this argument apply just as easily to Christianity as they do to bare theism. Bringing Jesus into the mix doesn't really help much, but there are a lot of people who say horrendous suffering brought them closer to God, aren't there? I'm not exactly sure what such appeals are supposed to tell us. Whether or not some people say their suffering brought them closer to God is not what's at issue. Of course people claim that. What's at issue is whether horrors would be necessary for our deepest good if such a deity were to exist. The answer is that they wouldn't, and I would submit that not seeing this results from a clear lack of imagination on the part of the objector, or worse, a failure to take the concept of God seriously in the first place. As for premise 4, I primarily appeal to divine empathy. A supremely empathetic being wouldn't allow horrific suffering unless it was absolutely necessary for the deepest good of finite persons. In response, it's been suggested that a perfectly empathetic God might be more interested in abstract ontological goods than our ultimate welfare, and that some of the greatest goods require evil. To which I've replied that there's no reason to think that. On traditional theism, if God is to be an unsurpassably great being, then it follows that all of the greatest goods are already contained in God. Let me expand the quote from Christian scholar Peter van Inwagen that I shared earlier. Jews, Christians, and Muslims insist that whether God creates a world, that is, whether he creates anything, is a matter of his free choice. Nothing in his nature compels him to create. He is not, for example, compelled to create by his moral perfection, for it is not better that there should be created things than that there should be no created things. It could not be better, for all goods are already contained, full and perfect and complete, in God. Pay careful attention to what's going on here. If we want to disagree and say that the greatest goods there are aren't contained in God prior to creation, then God needs to create if he wants to actualize a state of affairs wherein all of the greatest goods obtain. And worse still, if actualizing such a state of affairs is the best thing for God to do, and God always does what is best, then we've just made creation necessary. Additionally, if exemplifying virtue is always better than merely being disposed towards it, then in a real sense, God is lacking in a fundamental way before creating anything. This will be borderline blasphemous to many theists, and rightfully so. Notice that we're getting further and further away from the God of traditional theism, which is what I thought Cameron was here to defend. Things get worse when applied to Christianity. There's no sin, opportunity for forgiveness, etc. between the divine persons of the Trinity. But surely on that system, it must be the deepest possible relationship in the universe, all without the presence or possibility of evil between them, mind you. All of this to say, it's not at all clear that the greatest goods require evil on theism, and to suggest that some of them do is a perilous move. Because of this, my original points stand. When selecting whether to bring anything into existence at all, or surveying the landscape of possible worlds to create, surely a maximally empathetic being wouldn't actualize an inferior world where infants are used as target practice. But there are further ways to argue for the idea that God would only allow horrific suffering if it would contribute to the deepest good of finite persons. For example, we might appeal to plausible moral principles like only the sufferer's own benefit could justify a perfect God's permission of unwanted, undeserved suffering. This is a principle that is accepted by prominent Christian philosophers, and so surely it isn't out of bounds for me to employ here. I think it's fitting to wrap this up by sharing a quote from David Lewis, as it's very pertinent to what's transpiring here. Speaking of logical problems of evil, there is no evasion, unless the standards of success are set unreasonably high. Those who try to escape the conclusion have to insist that no use can be made of disputable premises, however antecedently credible those premises may be. But philosophers can and do dispute anything. Some, for example, are prepared to argue about the law of non-contradiction. The faithful who claim that the strong argument from evil leaves open a bare possibility, the sort of possibility only a philosopher could cherish, gain a victory in name only. And in this context, I wouldn't even grant Cameron the surface level win. Tap this video next to me to see Cameron's second rebuttal.